I'm going to tell a story on this one. Let's start. I wanted to tell a story with today's lesson, and really, it's the reason I'm still in the profession of physical therapy, or really probably in healthcare in general. And I'll tell you the story, and then I'll tell you why it's important to tell stories on your podcast. I was a radio DJ for 15 years. I know I've told you that before. Decided to hang up the headphones and the microphone and go back to school to become a physical therapist, changing directions. Halfway through school, though, well, I almost quit PT school. Walked into my advisor's office and I said, that's it, I'm out, I'm done. And the reason was I didn't feel like I fit. All my classmates around me were all so sure about what setting and where they were going to practice and who they were going to work with. And the more sure they became, the more self-conscious I became, because I liked a lot of different things in PT and my clinical experience in school, but I just didn't love one particular area. I was really unsure. And the further along we went in PT school, the more insecure I got. And the further along we went, the more secure it seemed my classmates got. Well, I got talked off the ledge by my advisor. She said, listen, just don't quit. Just stick it out. A couple months before we graduated at my PT program, we had a service learning experience to Costa Rica. And we got to work and treat in an orphanage for 2 weeks. And it was there that I sort of found my purpose and found my way to you today, actually. And here's what happened. At the orphanage, I wound up working with a patient. We'll call him G. And G was 18 years old and had muscular dystrophy. And for those of you who know, I just straight up hate muscular dystrophy. To describe G clinically, I'd say he had 2 out of 5 strength in wrist motion and 2 out of 5 strength in cervical rotation. Other than that, he was completely dependent. He sat in a tilt and space chair, completely dependent on where someone put him. Now, how would I actually describe G? Probably the happiest person I had ever met. All he wanted to do was be around his friends who also lived at the orphanage. And all he wanted to do with them was laugh and tell jokes and talk about football, his favorite team, La Liga. Happiest person I've ever met to this day, and it's not an exaggeration. So I got to work with G for most of the 2 weeks while I was there. And if you've ever been on a service trip, you'll hear this cliche. It's said so much that you really can't believe it, that you get more than you give. And I'll tell you this, I get it. It's a cliche because it's said a lot, but it's absolutely true. But you'll never know it unless you do it. But you will walk away with a lot more than you gave. So as we got close to wrapping up our 2 weeks in Costa Rica, I was starting to get a little emotional. I felt connected to G. I felt like I was making a difference in his everyday life, right? I was getting a lot more out of this exchange than G was. And as we got closer to leaving, something bothered me. We left him no better than we had found him. As I was getting on the bus to leave, we had made his time there good. I know the time there for me was great, but we didn't change anything. We didn't alter anything. And maybe that's just the course of muscular dystrophy. We weren't able to actually change anything that was going to resonate for the rest of his life. And I left there feeling empty, and I decided to do something about it. On the ride to our destination after the orphanage, I decided, well, I just launched this podcast about physical therapy. I was going to use that to give something to G that could change his minute-to-minute existence. So I mentioned he was just completely dependent in a tilt and space chair. Every minute of every day when he was out of bed, he was put somewhere, really not able to decide anything that he could look at or anywhere that he could go. Well, I decided that we were going to get him a power wheelchair. He had the strength in his wrist to do it. He had the mental capacity to use it. So I said, well, we're going to give it to him. But he lives in an orphanage. So I decided, with 66 days left until I graduated from PT school, I was going to make sure I walked across that stage, knowing I had at least done one thing to help one other human being. So I grabbed this microphone, this one right here, and I started telling his story. I started telling his story and why it was so important, why the audience should come into this story with me and make a donation. And we were going to raise enough money to buy him a brand new power wheelchair. And I told the story in 100 different ways. I told the story about him. I told the story about interactions. I was painting a picture about a human being, how happy he was every day when he and his friends would come out into the yard and just be together. And then I talked about how it was just a travesty that there is something that exists in this world, a power wheelchair, that would benefit his minute-to-minute existence, except there was this big divide. Here was this expensive power wheelchair over here that could help, and here's G, living in an orphanage in Costa Rica. Those two things were so far apart, but together, what if we could bring them closer and closer together? I let the audience in on this story about a real person and about a real problem that they could actually help fix. And slowly but surely, with about a week to go before I graduated, I got the news from my professor that we had actually reached our goal. I was going to walk across the stage at graduation knowing that I had at least done one thing to help another human being. And for that, I felt a little bit better. The best part, though, when the university found out about the story, they decided, well, someone's got to get the chair down there and show he and his caregivers how to actually use it and take care of it. It was on that trip back to Costa Rica to see G, I was able to interview him as I put him in the chair with his caregivers. And I asked him a simple question. Once he figured out that he was in control of this chair, I had the microphone rolling and I said, "Where do you want to go?" And his response through the translator was, "Absolutely perfect." And here's what he said. "I just want to ride." My work here was done. Took us about an hour to actually get him to figure out how to use it right. After the first 15 minutes were a little bit questionable. He's kind of driving a little bit crooked like he'd had a couple drinks. After about 20 minutes, he was, banging into corners. But after about 35 minutes, he navigated himself down a path, around a corner, through a doorway, and sat himself at the head of the table for lunch. And I thought, now my work is done. So when people ask me what the greatest part of my podcast is, I don't need to think too hard. I know that's exactly what it was, because my podcast could just explode tomorrow. No one could ever listen again, and I would have at least accomplished one thing with this microphone and a story about a real person. And I allowed that audience into that story to help us make a difference. The power of a story. By the way, all that is 100% true. And you can find that episode on my podcast. It's episode 94. And the reason I told that story is, number one, I love telling that story. It's rare that you can easily identify one of your proudest moments, one of your best accomplishments without having to think. That's it, right there. I'm not sure if it'll ever be topped, but that's always going to remain near the top of the list. But here's the importance. Now, I was telling this story with my newly launched podcast because I really cared. I didn't want to just leave Costa Rica with those experiences. I wanted to give something back. And what I was inadvertently doing was telling a story in 3 ways. There are 3 elements in telling a great story, and they're in Latin, so they just sound serious. They're ethos, pathos, and logos. Without strategically doing it, I accidentally stumbled upon these 3 elements of the story, and I made sure to mix them up accordingly and repeat. So here's what they are. Ethos is credibility and ethics. I brought some of my professors on who were experts at seating and mobility. They were experts, credible. They brought facts and figures into the story saying, yes, this is the type of chair that he needs. Well, I pressed them. If we got him this chair, would it actually change his minute-to-minute existence? Absolutely, they said. I talked to his caregivers. I talked to some people from the facility. Yes, this would absolutely change things for him. I brought in credibility and ethics. That made sure the audience knew, okay, this is legitimate. They can clearly see by doing X, we could accomplish Y. Sharing the same reality by making sure I brought ethos into the story. Logos is logic and reasoning. You can see logic and reasoning in the story. I showed you a clear story of need and how they, the audience, could help fill that need. Send me $5. I asked for $5, $10. I had companies join in, but I was very, very clear about the story of need and how the audience could help me fill that need. And finally, pathos. That's emotion and feeling. I told you a story about a person, gave that person a name. I told you a little bit about them. I made you paint a picture in your mind about what G looked like maybe. Maybe you could see a version of what you thought he looked like and how he acted and how big his smile was. I made you see them, and I mixed those three things together. And where they all crossed, that is the element of a great story. So make sure you tell a story to your audience. Now, this doesn't mean every single episode needs to be a long epic tale, but just remember, if you really want to hammer in a point, if you really want to leave your audience with something, tell a story. And there's a reason we do that. Our brains are wired for stories. Our brains are wired for conversation over presentation. I told that story to my audience, and I was so glad and happy and proud that it resonated. Keep this in mind when you're recording your content. What stories can you tell? What anecdotes can you bring in to hammer home a point or a concept? Because remember, your audience has a brain, and we are all wired to receive stories, conversation over presentation. So make sure, whenever you can, you tell a story.